Okay, let's dive into this fascinating source material we've got today. It really kicks off with a truly intriguing question.
Hmm.
How in the world did the Apostle Paul manage to plant churches that were, well, so complete, spread across multiple regions, and sometimes apparently do it in just weeks or months?
It's a question that gets right to the heart of effectiveness, doesn't it? I mean,
Well,
we know about the longer stays,
yeah,
3 years maybe in Arabia, years in Cilicia, 18 months in Corinth.
right.
But this source really highlights those other periods, especially on his third journey, where the pace just felt incredibly accelerated. Like he almost had to move fast.
Yeah, exactly. And that shift in pace, the source argues, points to a shift in method. It introduces this really powerful concept, mission hubs.
Hmm.
So our mission for this deep dive, really guided by your source material here, is to dig into that method. We're going to unpack the key distinction it makes between these mission hubs and that very different historical model of the mission station.
Right.
Understand the context of both and see what timeless lessons we can maybe pull out from Paul's approach, looking to at later figures like Donald McGavran.
Absolutely.
Ah,
And as we explore, you'll find some surprising threads. I mean, everything from the strategic importance of ancient cities to a pretty sharp critique of certain historical mission models
okay.
and a compelling vision for multiplication that honestly still challenges us today.
So where do we start with this? Your source material really zooms in on one place as a kind of prime example of this hub idea.
It does. That place is Ephesus. And, it wasn't just a random stop for Paul. Seems he had his sights set on it for some years. It was clearly a strategic priority.
And when you look at the description in the source, you can see exactly why. It paints a really vivid picture of Ephesus.
Oh, it really was a powerhouse city.
Mhm.
The source points out it was the major western terminus for the Silk Road and other significant Roman roads, too, connecting east to west Africa to Asia Minor. It was a buzzing center for commerce, banking,
Yeah.
shipping. I mean, just think about the scale. A theater seating over 24,000 people.
24,000.
Yeah, a massive harbor. And, of course, the renowned Temple of Artemis, or Diana.
So it wasn't just big, it was a junction, a real crossroads.
Exactly.
But the source is careful to note, right, that Paul didn't only pick the absolute biggest cities. He saw Ephesus's potential specifically as a hub.
That's the key point. Like
Yeah.
Antioch had functioned earlier, perhaps, but with his gaze now extending further west, towards Rome and maybe even Spain,
Okay.
he saw it as a place not just to plant one church, but as a launch pad for a movement that could spread far beyond its walls.
Right.
And the source identifies a kind of model Paul seemed to employ here, one that sort of echoed Jesus' own ministry. It involved preparation, intentionally laying foundations, equipping teams, developing leaders,
And then the multiplication part.
and then critically empowering movement multiplication.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack that preparation phase for Ephesus then, because it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment arrival, was it? Your source details several crucial steps leading up to his main ministry period there.
That's right. It actually began much earlier. On his second journey, the Spirit specifically prevented Paul, Silas, and Timothy from preaching in the province of Asia, Acts 16.6.
Right, I remember that.
Now, the source doesn't give a single definitive why, but it explores some potential reasons. Maybe God wanted Paul to connect with Luke first,
Hmm.
or perhaps Lydia, who became a key contact, needed to be prepared somehow. Or maybe it was about getting Priscilla and Aquila to Corinth first, and then positioning them for Ephesus later.
Yeah, interesting possibilities. But whatever the specific divine logic, the core insight highlighted here is Paul's obedience, right? Years spent in places he hadn't initially planned could actually be God's prep work.
Exactly. God's preparation for the very place he had his heart set on, and that connects directly to laying foundations.
Oh.
Well, on that second journey, Paul met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. They shared their home, their trade took it. They were tent makers like him, and they partnered with him in church planting there.
Okay.
Your source then notes that Paul specifically took this seasoned couple with him and left them in Ephesus at the end of that journey. He made a brief stop himself in the synagogue, but he tasked them with preparing the ground for his return.
So they were the critical advance team, already living and working in the city, laying groundwork.
Precisely. And they weren't just sitting idle, according to the source. They were actively equipping others while they waited.
Okay, like who?
Well, they played a really significant role in further equipping Apollos. The source notes he initially knew only the baptism of John.
Right.
Priscilla and Aquila took him aside, explained the way of God more accurately, and the source also suggests they may have been instrumental in connecting Paul with another group, about 12 men, when he finally arrived.
Ah, the 12 disciples in Acts 19.
That seems to be the group, yeah. Men who also only knew John's baptism initially, but were ready to hear more. After learning about Jesus from Paul, they were baptized in his name and received the Holy Spirit.
So just think about that sequence. God's specific guidance years before. A trained couple strategically positioned.
Yeah.
That couple equipping others, like Apollos.
Right.
And those equipped individuals potentially forming the initial core team that Paul connects with. That's really intentional groundwork.
It truly is. And then comes the leadership equipping piece. The source suggests Paul likely took these 12 men, perhaps, with him to the synagogue initially. He spent 3 months there arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God.
Okay.
But when opposition arose, he didn't just give up or leave town. He took the disciples with him, probably this core group, and moved the meeting. They held daily discussions in the lecture hall of Tyrannus.
Daily.
Daily. That sustained daily interaction was just fundamental, it seems, to developing these key leaders.
Preparation, foundations, team building, leadership equipping. Okay, then we see the explosion of impact. That's when Ephesus really becomes that multiplying hub.
And the results described are, well, they're breathtaking. The source emphasizes that Paul continued those daily discussions in Tyrannus' hall for 2 full years.
2 years, every single day. That's just an incredible commitment to equipping people.
It really is. And the punchline, the core outcome from Acts 19, verse 10, is what the source really wants us to focus on.
Which is?
So that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord.
Wow. All the Jews and Greeks in the province of Asia.
There it is. The multiplication wasn't just limited to a single church in Ephesus, however large or important. It reached an entire Roman province from that church plant acting as a hub.
That's incredible. And the source backs that claim up, right? By listing some tangible results of this outreach and multiplication.
It does. It points out that during this period, the 7 churches mentioned later in Revelation were established across the province. You know, Ephesus itself, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea.
All 7 of those churches planted during this time.
That's the implication. And other churches, too, planted in the nearby Lycus River Valley, places like Hierapolis, Colossae, and even churches, meeting in the homes of key believers like Nympha and Philemon.
It's a picture of just rapid, region-wide expansion, all flowing from one strategic location, from that hub.
Exactly.
Now, your source takes this incredible example from Paul and then pivots quite sharply, doesn't it, to contrast it with a very different model that became dominant centuries later.
It does, the mission station model.
Right, and it acknowledges how challenging it is for us today to even conceive of a church network without things like offices, significant staff, institutions, systems.
Yeah, things that often mirror modern business or even governmental structures. It's hard to picture anything else sometimes.
And the source argues that our current approaches, even those born out of, say, the 18th and 19th century revivals, were significantly shaped by the prevailing cultures of their time.
And by inherited institutionalism, some of which, it suggests, might trace back even to figures like Constantine in the Roman Empire.
Suggesting that older structures, things like cathedrals, church schools, hospitals, were essentially replaced with Protestant versions built on similar institutional foundations, often in prominent locations.
That's the idea presented, yeah.
Yeah.
And the foreign mission movement that grew out of those later revivals, while, undeniably doing immense good in proclaiming the gospel and seeking human flourishing,
Of course.
it also reflected and perhaps unintentionally sometimes reinforced the prevailing colonial context of that era.
Okay. So what did that typical 19th or early 20th century mission station actually look like, according to the source?
Well, the picture painted is quite specific. You'd have missionaries arriving, often working kind of in conjunction with colonial authorities to secure land. They'd establish a compound, often fenced or secured in some way. Inside, you'd find large houses for the expatriate missionaries, maybe smaller ones for national workers.
Okay.
And then the core buildings, often a boarding school, a clinic or hospital, maybe a printing press, and, of course, the central church building itself.
And the way it operated sounds fundamentally different from Paul's house-based, movement-focused approach we were just talking
Oh,
about.
completely. The source points out how children were often removed from their families, from their natural relational streams, to come and live on the station.
Hmm. Removed from their context.
Yeah. And even from a young age, they might contribute to school fees by, say, working for the missionaries or maintaining the campus grounds. Funding flowed largely from home churches, agencies, donors back in the sending countries.
Okay.
And opportunities for, like, education or employment were often concentrated on the station itself for those who were educated, faithful attendees. You kind of created this self-contained community.
It sounds very centralized, very dependent on the external structure and funding.
It does.
And while the source is absolutely clear in acknowledging that many, many people did become believers and valuable church workers through these stations.
Yes, it's very clear about that positive impact.
Yeah.
Definitely doesn't dismiss the good that was done.
Right. But it also highlights some significant concerns and critiques that were being voiced apparently even 100 years ago.
It does. Some pretty sharp questions were being asked back then.
Like what? What were those key critiques presented in the source?
Well, several crucial ones. First, it questions the underlying goal, sometimes implicitly held. Was the objective really about Christianizing foreign cultures? Or was it about fulfilling Jesus' great commission to make disciples of all ethnic, all people groups? The source kind of challenges the very idea of distinct foreign versus home cultures anyway, especially in our increasingly globalized world.
That really gets at the mission's core definition, doesn't it?
What else? It raises questions about the outcomes produced. Were stations primarily making disciples and multiplying churches, or were they perhaps inadvertently creating a sort of privileged caste or class?
Okay.
Was the model truly effective for all people groups within a society, or did it tend to overlook or maybe even undermine or damage certain segments?
So not just the stated goal, but the actual impact, intended or unintended.
Exactly. And a major point of concern presented is sustainability. The source really asks whether this model, with its heavy infrastructure and, dependence on foreign funds, was ever truly sustainable long term.
Right.
It raises pointed questions about control, potential manipulation, when funding flows primarily from outside the community being reached.
And the source doesn't just ask the question, does it? It describes some pretty stark consequences when those foreign funds diminished or stopped.
It really does. It paints a picture of, once impressive schools, clinics, church buildings built with homeland funds now standing in crumbling disrepair in many places. Small business ventures started on the stations often collapsed. And with fewer funds coming from home churches today, the source notes that many institutions originally built on stations are now staffed and funded by national governments.
Which changes things.
Which, the source argues, can further dilute the original evangelistic focus of the founders.
That image of crumbling buildings really drives home the dependency issue. It feels like a powerful cautionary tale in a way.
It does. And the source uses this sharp contrast to bring us back quite firmly to the methods of Jesus and Paul. It states emphatically that neither Jesus nor the apostles used the mission station model.
Right.
Or even established the kind of offices or administrative centers we might consider essential today.
Their approach was just radically different then.
Fundamentally so, yes. The source highlights their pattern, basing activities in homes, working within existing relational networks or streams.
Okay.
They provided on-the-job training, essentially, teaching new disciples not just what to believe, but how to go and make disciples themselves.
Right, passing it on.
Exactly. They weren't focused on building institutions. They were cultivating a movement among the people. They worked with urgency, gathered new disciples, equipped them quickly, and, crucially, left them empowered to multiply in their own contexts.
And the source even prompts us, doesn't it, to consider the deeper theological reasons behind why they use these methods.
It does. It doesn't necessarily answer it fully, but notes it's relevant. It adds that while a modern office or center might have practical reasons today, it would need to operate in a way that actively enables and enhances these core principles of movement and multiplication, not somehow hinder them.
So it's not a simple office bad, home's good thing.
Not at all. It's a challenge to ensure our structures actually serve the mission dynamic, rather than becoming the mission themselves, maybe unintentionally.
That makes sense. The source then reflects on how difficult it is historically to change established systems, right?
Yeah, it used that powerful example of the early church in Jerusalem, becoming settled, comfortable perhaps, and needing the shock of persecution to finally scatter them and fulfill the ends of the earth mandate from Acts 1.
A really sobering historical parallel. And this brings the source to Donald McGavran. He's identified as the father of church growth.
That's right. McGavran is a really pivotal figure in this whole discussion. The source says he essentially rediscovered, or at least re-emphasized, the Ponte ta ethne principle within the Great Commission, Matthew 28.
Okay, Ponte ta ethno, and the source clarifies what that means.
Yes, it points out it's often translated as all the nations, but maybe more accurately means all people groups. Distinct populations defined by cultural, physical, geographical ties, including things like castes in India where he worked.
Ah, okay, so much more specific than just political nations.
Exactly. And for McGavran, this meant that effective evangelism and church multiplication needed to happen within and across every single segment of society. No group left out.
And this is where his concepts come in, right? Like people movements.
Precisely. Conversion and growth happening naturally within existing relational streams, families, communities, and finding bridges of God, those key individuals, like in Luke 10, who can connect the gospel to their whole network.
Okay.
The source quotes McGavran's deep conviction here. He said, "A mighty multiplication of living congregations must occur in most pieces of the mosaic in most countries." He saw this, above all else, as the challenge of church growth.
He didn't mince words about it, did he? The source even quotes him calling it sinful to object to focusing on people movements while standing empty-handed out of ripe harvest fields.
Whoa. Yeah, that's strong language. It really highlights the intense urgency he felt. And your source attributes this urgency to two key things that shaped him personally.
What were those?
One was witnessing the kind of gradualism, maybe complacency he saw among many mission station employees, just maintaining things.
Right.
And the other was the profound personal impact of his young daughter's death. That sharpened his focus and urgency immensely, it seems.
That personal context definitely adds a layer to his drive. The source mentions he actually left the mission station structure to pursue his vision, right? Making disciples, planting churches within relational streams.
He did, but then it seems the path wasn't quite what he'd envisioned. The source argues that the mission station model, in a different guise, sort of pursued him.
How so?
His vision, his language even, was hijacked, derailed, and redefined, as the source puts it. It got morphed into what the source describes as the American Wagner-Wimber version of church growth.
Ah, the movement that became widely popularized, often associated with the megachurch model, especially in the U.S.
Exactly. And the source characterizes that popular church growth model as, in many ways, a kind of revised global north mission station approach, still focused on attracting people to a central place, a program, an institution.
And McGavran's reaction?
It seems he was deeply frustrated by this. His attempts later in life to correct the course, to bring it back to disciple-making movements among ethne, were largely overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by churches shaped by what the source calls the Americanization and McDonaldization of global culture. He felt his foundational language, church growth, people movements, was co-opted and used in ways that were, for him, inconsistent with Jesus' original commission.
So despite his powerful insights and his passion, the source suggests McGavran was largely unsuccessful in reshaping the overall course of missions through persuasion alone.
That seems to be the argument, yeah. It suggests that in the global south, where many of the original mission stations were located, change was often driven more by external forces.
Like what?
Like donor funds drying up, the rise of nationalism leading to government restrictions or even confiscation of property. Practical realities rather than a widespread embrace of the apostles' methods simply because they were seen as more biblically faithful.
Which brings us right up to the present day and the application for us, especially maybe in the global north context. Your source poses a really potent question here.
It does.
Could similar forces, external pressures, be the drivers of change here? Things like shifts in giving patterns, maybe growing cultural antagonism towards Christianity, or even just the increasingly impossible costs of real estate, especially in major urban centers.
It frames the core challenge very pointedly. Do we just hold on to existing, often institutional, mission station-like models until those external pressures force us to change?
Right.
Or does the apostles' vision, focused on multiplication within relational streams, unlock genuine new possibilities for us right now? Can existing ministry centers actually be revamped, reimagined to function as true mission hubs?
That's the critical question for churches today, isn't it? And the source circles back then to redefine what a mission hub really looks like in this context.
It does. It describes it not just as a church building or program, but as a local church that is intentionally and regularly equipping and sending out disciple makers and church planting teams.
Okay, intentionally and regularly.
Yeah. Their goal isn't just maintaining their own congregation, but reaching an entire area, a city, a state, a region, maybe even further with the gospel, and aiming specifically for multiplying plants, not just starting one-off churches here and there.
That sounds like it requires a level of intensity, a level of commitment
Okay.
far beyond running a typical church program schedule.
It absolutely does. The source emphasizes that planting such a hub or transitioning to become one demands passionate commitment, a lot of hard work, and what it calls cruciform sacrifice.
Cruciform sacrifice.
Yeah, it's pretty blunt. Planting a mission hub is not a 9-to-5 job. It has to flow from something deeper, a consuming vision, rooted in God's heart for the lost, focused relentlessly on multiplying disciples and churches to reach the ends of the earth.
That idea of a consuming vision really contrasts sharply with just maintaining an existing structure, institution, doesn't it? It's about purpose defining the activity.
It really is, and the source does offer a modern example that seems to embody this approach.
Which is?
The Timothy Initiative, or
Yes.
TTI.
Ah, okay, TTI.
Yes, apparently launched from a local church down in Florida. It partners with and equips what they call Timothys, essentially, local pastors and church planters around the world. Equips them to be disciples who make disciples and plant churches.
And the model.
The model is simple but powerful. Everyone trained is expected to plant at least one multiplying, simple, reproducing church in their own region or context.
And the numbers the source mentions are quite striking. Something like
Nearly 68,000 churches planted in the last decade or so through their partners and the individuals they've equipped.
68,000. Wow.
It's presented as a modern illustration of that multiplication dynamic the source is traced all the way back to Paul in Ephesus.
That's incredible.
And finally, the source points us back to the Bible itself. To the epistles, Paul wrote from prison in Rome letters like Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon. It notes that these were written to churches planted as a result of that third journey's multiplying movement. And they contain valuable insights, principles for today's churches that might be looking to transition, maybe from being social clubs or maintenance-focused institutions, towards truly functioning as mission hubs.
So these ancient letters written to those very churches that grew out of this hub model hold contemporary relevance for us thinking about this today. That's a great point to land on for the main discussion.
It really connects the historical picture directly to our modern reality and potential.
Well, we've definitely done a deep dive into this material today. We've explored that picture of Paul's rapid, multiplying strategy centered on hubs like Ephesus, contrasted it sharply with the historical mission station model and the critiques it faced,
Right.
and followed that legacy through figures like McGavran and even into a modern example like TTI.
And the core tension remains, doesn't it? Highlighted by the source, the resistance of established, settled systems versus the biblical imperative, the vision of multiplication rooted in relationships and movements among people, rather than being confined primarily to institutions.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap this up, let's leave you, our listener, with a thought to chew on, drawing directly from the implications raised by your source material today.
Okay.
Considering the powerful forces potentially reshaping churches and ministry today, whether they are financial realities, shifting cultural landscapes, or even the sheer practical challenge of physical space and real estate costs, does the choice between simply maintaining an existing system and embracing a vision of multiplication start to feel less like an academic debate about history and more like a practical, perhaps even necessary path forward? What does it truly take for established structures, maybe even our own churches, to loosen their grip on maintenance and be consumed by that vision of reaching all people groups? And thinking about the principles we've pulled from Jesus and Paul's methods today, what might a genuine multiplying movement look like, sound like, feel like in your specific context right now? Something to think about.